The sound of my father's text burned into my hand. It was the last thing I expected to hear on the morning of my wedding. I stood behind the chapel doors, dressed in my Navy uniform. The gold buttons glimmered under the soft light, and the weight of the 4 stars on my shoulders pressed heavily against my chest. Behind me stood my team, some of them decorated with medals I personally pinned on them, others carrying scars, some visible, others not. All of them stood tall, silent, and proud, my family in every sense of the word. But in front of me, beyond those doors, waited 200 SEALs. And my fiancé, James. He was the only one in the room who didn't know what this moment truly meant to me. The text message in my hand glowed with a message from a number I hadn't saved in years. I knew who it was even before I read the words. Disgraceful. 5 simple words that echoed in my chest. My father, Colonel Frank Holstead, my flesh and blood, the man who raised me to believe that nothing in life came easy, nothing was handed to you, everything had to be earned. But this was different. This wasn't about my military career or my training. This wasn't about my achievements or the things I had done for the country. This was about a personal insult, an insult from the very man who had shaped me, built me, but never believed in me. I should have deleted it. I should have let the silence take over. But I didn't. I stared at it for a full minute, not in shock but in clarity. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I was done. This was who he was, and this was who I had become. The doors swung open. The first step onto the polished wood floor felt like it was in perfect sync with my heartbeat. The sound of my heels on the floor was sharp and steady, not out of nervousness but out of purpose. Behind me I could feel my team's eyes on me. The chapel, filled with warriors, was silent. As I walked down the aisle, the murmurs died down, replaced by the heavy stillness of respect. 200 men stood. In unison they rose to their feet, saluting me, not for my rank, not because I was an officer, but because of the life I had lived. And in that moment someone shouted, "Admiral on deck." The entire room snapped to attention. The sound of 200 warriors standing in perfect harmony filled the space, the echo of their respect resonating deep within me. The tears I had held back for so long were not tears of pain but of honor. I had earned this moment. Not from my bloodline, not from the title, but from the life I had built. The silent recognition from the men who had fought by my side, bled with me, and stood by me in ways my father never did. That was what mattered. I walked toward James, who was standing at the altar, his eyes shimmering with pride. He knew the weight of this moment better than anyone else in the room. He had always known me for who I truly was, beyond the uniform, beyond the medals. As I reached the altar, I took a deep breath, steadying myself for the moment that had been years in the making. I wasn't walking down the aisle to prove anything to my father. I was walking down the aisle to prove something to myself. My father, the man who had never truly believed in me, would never be there to see this moment as a victory. But I didn't need him to. The doors were closed on me. But this was my time. This was my moment. The silence after the shout of "Admiral on deck" lingered in the air, but it was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. The weight of it pressed down on me in a way I had never experienced before. I wasn't expecting this. But I wasn't surprised either. My journey, this moment, wasn't just about a wedding. It was about everything that had led up to it. Everything my father had never seen, never understood. I looked at James standing at the altar. His face, calm yet deeply proud, was the only thing in the room that felt like home. His love had always been unwavering, the one thing that grounded me. He had never once asked me to dim my light. He had always told me that my uniform wasn't just a suit of fabric and metal, it was a representation of who I was. Not just as a soldier but as a person, strong, resilient, and fiercely independent. But as I stood there, the recognition of my achievements, my own strength, felt surreal. My father's rejection, the long years of silence, hadn't broken me. They had only steeled me. My father had always believed that a woman could never live up to his legacy, that the army was a man's world, that only sons could carry the flag forward. For years I had tried to prove him wrong. But today, standing here in front of 200 decorated warriors, I realized that I didn't need his approval anymore. I had earned it. Behind me I could feel the steady breath of my team. The men and women who had seen me at my weakest and strongest. The ones who had fought beside me, who had bled with me, who had trusted me with their lives. They weren't just colleagues. They were my family. They didn't care about rank or title. They cared about character, about leadership. They stood in that chapel because of who I was, not because of the uniform I wore. It wasn't the stars or the stripes that earned their respect. It was the years I had spent by their side, leading them with the same discipline and courage my father had once demanded from me. I had risen through the ranks by proving my worth through actions. And yet, my father had always refused to see me as worthy of the title I carried. He had dismissed my every achievement, every step forward, every battle won. To him I was always a disappointment. But today, in front of these men, I knew I had surpassed him. I had earned the title not because of my bloodline but because of who I had become. As the ceremony continued, my mind couldn't help but drift back to the years of silence, to the countless moments where I had tried and failed to gain his approval. I remembered the time I was 16, ironing his uniform, his medals hanging in the background. I'd asked him once as I pressed the creases into his sleeves, "Why don't you ever tell me you're proud of me?" He had only looked at me, his expression cold, before muttering, "Soldiers don't whine." That was always his answer. Silence. Distance. He had always believed that I couldn't carry his legacy, that I was weak. But what he didn't know was that I had built my own legacy, one that didn't need his approval to shine. I wasn't walking down this aisle to show him anything. I was walking down to show myself that I had become the leader I was always meant to be. And for once I wasn't doing it alone. My team was there. James was there. My chosen family was there. As I stood in front of him, ready to exchange vows with James, I realized that the weight I had been carrying for so long, my father's rejection, the years of silence, had been lifted. Not because he wasn't there, but because, for the first time, I no longer needed him to validate me. My father's absence in that room wasn't a loss. It was a symbol. A symbol of how far I had come. And when the final words were said, when the vows were exchanged, I stood tall. Not as a soldier with 4 stars on my shoulder, but as a woman who had fought not for recognition but for respect. I had earned it. As the ceremony drew to a close, and the applause echoed around the chapel, I felt a sense of calm I had never known before. The air was thick with respect, with honor, but most importantly with recognition, not just of me but of everything I had sacrificed to get here. The years of hard work, the battles, the sleepless nights, the personal cost of choosing this life, all of it had led me to this moment. And yet, there was still that nagging feeling deep within me. Even as I stood with James, my newlywed husband, in a moment that should have been mine to fully enjoy, I couldn't shake the thought of my father. My mother's death, the silence he had shown me after her passing, had left a scar. It was a wound I had learned to ignore, but it was there, just beneath the surface. He never acknowledged the pain of losing her, never reached out during my most vulnerable times. Instead, he sent short, cold messages, dismissing my grief as if it were just another duty to bear. And yet, when I had sent him the invitation to my wedding, when I had tried to reach out to him, I knew deep down that I shouldn't have expected anything different. He wouldn't come. Not for me. Not for his daughter. It wasn't about the wedding or the ceremony, it was about him. It was about his pride. His ego. And no matter how much I had tried to prove myself, to make him proud, he never saw me as I saw myself. Still, I had walked down that aisle, with every step affirming that I was not defined by his rejection. When I had first joined the Navy, I had believed that proving him wrong would be the ultimate satisfaction. But now, as I stood at the altar, my heart didn't race. It steadied. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped needing him to see me. We left the chapel hand in hand as husband and wife, and my team followed. I could feel their eyes on me, their respect and support. It was something I hadn't fully realized until now. This was my real family, the ones who saw me for who I was, not for who they wanted me to be. And when we reached the reception, the last thing I expected was for someone to approach me. Big, tattooed forearms, a towering figure with quiet strength. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. He was one of my former SEALs. The kind of guy who didn't need to say anything for you to know where he stood. He stood before me now, his eyes downcast, but there was something there, something unspoken. Then, in the most unexpected way, he said it. "We never stood for you because of your rank, ma'am. We stood because you never made us feel small." I didn't know how to respond at first. No one had ever said anything like that to me. Not my father, not anyone. I just stood there, processing the weight of it. The sincerity in his voice, the depth of respect in his eyes. For the first time in my life, I realized that I had never needed to chase approval. The respect I had earned was from living the values my father had tried to instill in me, not by following his rules but by making my own path. As the night wore on, I found myself alone outside, looking at the dark sky, reflecting on everything that had brought me to this point. James stood beside me, not asking anything, just being there. I felt his quiet presence beside me, but there was one question I couldn't avoid. "Did you hear from him?" James asked gently. I nodded. The text message was still fresh in my mind. But this time there was no anger, no sadness. just acceptance. He called it disgraceful, I said, the words feeling like a distant echo, a remnant of a past I was ready to leave behind. James didn't press further. Instead he asked, "Do you believe that?" I looked down at my uniform. The gold trim, the ribbons, the stars on my shoulder. I thought of the 200 men who had stood for me. I thought of my team, of all the soldiers I had led, the lives I had protected. And I realized in that quiet moment that none of it mattered to him. And it didn't need to. "No," I said finally, looking up at James. "I don't believe it." It had been 3 days since the wedding, and yet the silence from my father lingered like an uninvited guest. No phone calls, no texts, no acknowledgement. I'd gotten used to it though. Over the years I had learned not to expect anything more. His absence from the wedding wasn't a surprise. It was a confirmation that I would never be enough for him no matter what I achieved. But the silence was louder than anything he could have said. James and I were in Maine now, at a quiet coastal inn, trying to escape the madness of the past few days. The old wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the air smelled of salt and seaweed. It was everything we needed, peaceful, slow, with no expectations. But despite the tranquility, there was still that nagging feeling that I couldn't shake. The text, the rejection, my father's refusal to show up for me one last time, it was all too much. I hadn't checked my phone in hours. James, however, handed it to me gently one morning. The screen lit up with a message. My heart sank when I saw the name. My cousin Claire had sent a picture. The photo was blurry, taken from a distance. It was the parking lot of the chapel, and in the corner, standing rigid and proud, was my father. His posture perfect, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, watching the wedding from afar. There was something about the way he stood that struck me, a coldness in his form, like he was in a foreign place, disconnected from it all. I stared at the photo longer than I should have, trying to understand what I was seeing. Regret? Softness? Remorse? Or was it simply the refusal to let go? A man who had chosen distance over redemption, who couldn't bring himself to be part of something he couldn't control. But there was one more photo, taken moments later. His figure was turning away, walking in the opposite direction. I handed the phone back to James, my breath heavy, and the words slipped out before I could stop them. He came. But he couldn't stand. James didn't react immediately. He stood beside me for a moment, his silence saying more than words could ever express. He understood. The hurt was deep, but it wasn't unexpected. My father's presence in my life had always been a presence of absence. He came when it was convenient for him and left when things got too complicated. But the truth was clear now. He couldn't even be there for me when it mattered most. And that spoke volumes. Later that week, an invitation arrived at the hotel. It wasn't from my father. It was from the Pentagon. They wanted me to give a keynote address at a leadership conference. The invite wasn't because I was the first woman admiral. It wasn't about that. It was because they recognized the work I had done to save lives through the systems I had put in place. It was because my leadership had led to real, tangible change. I almost said no. But then I remembered the young sailor, the one who had written me that note before he took his life. He had been the only one who truly saw me for who I was. That's why I said yes. For him. For the people I had led and fought for. The speech itself wasn't just about leadership. It wasn't about military strategy or ethics in command. It was about truth. The truth that had taken me so long to accept. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned. I had earned mine. Through the blood I had shed, through the lives I had touched, and through the strength I had built within myself. I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone, especially not to my father. I was speaking for the ones who never got the chance to speak. The applause was overwhelming, but it wasn't the standing ovation that got to me. It was the feeling of knowing that I had built something that mattered, something that wasn't dependent on anyone else's approval. But as I left the podium, a letter arrived at my office the next morning. It was handwritten. The same scrawl I had seen for years. It was my father's handwriting. I watched your speech. I've read your proposals. You've built a career that wasn't about proving anyone wrong, including me. You built it to save lives. And I finally see that now. I missed the standing ovation, but I hope I haven't missed my chance to stand beside you, even in a small way. I read it 3 times. I didn't cry. I didn't burn it. I just sat with it. Later that evening, I handed the letter to James. He raised an eyebrow, clearly curious, but didn't press for answers. After reading it, he asked softly, "Do you want to meet him?" I paused. For a moment I didn't know. Do I owe him anything? No, I said quietly. I don't owe him anything. But James, ever the voice of reason, added, no. But maybe you owe yourself the choice. A week later I found myself standing at Arlington, the weight of the moment pressing down on my shoulders. The grass beneath my feet was meticulously trimmed, and the silence was absolute. I had worn my uniform not to make a statement, but because it was who I was. My father stood in front of me, no longer the imposing figure of the military man I had grown up with. Gone were the crisp uniforms, the medals, the stature. Instead he was in civilian clothes, slacks, jacket, no pins, no bars, no armor. Just a man older, smaller, and somehow more fragile than I remembered. The years had been unkind to him, but what struck me most was the emptiness in his eyes. He wasn't the same man who had shaped me, not the same man I had once admired. We stood there in silence, the air thick between us, and for the first time in my life I saw him, really saw him. He wasn't just my father anymore. He was a man who had carried his own burdens, his own regrets, his own silence. A man who had been fighting his own battles for far too long. But this time I wasn't going to let him control the narrative. He spoke first, his voice low but steady. "You look like your mother when you stand like that." The words hit harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I missed hearing her name, how much I had longed to hear him say something, anything, that acknowledged her life, her passing, and the life we had shared as a family. But there was no time for that now. There was no time for the past to consume us. "I never understood you," he admitted quietly. "Not your decisions. Not your path. But maybe I do now." He paused, swallowing hard. "I've never known how to be your father, not the way you needed. I never knew how to support you. I was always so focused on you being, like me. I wanted you to be strong like me, but I didn't realize that strength means different things to different people." His words hung in the air, heavier than I had anticipated. They weren't an apology. They weren't a plea for forgiveness. But they were something I hadn't heard in years: recognition. He wasn't just acknowledging me as a soldier or as his daughter. He was recognizing me as a person, as a human being who had become her own force. Before I could respond, he stepped back, straightened his back, and did something that I never thought I would see. With slow deliberation, he raised his hand and saluted me. It wasn't a crisp, sharp military gesture. His movements were slow, unpracticed, but the gesture was earnest. For the first time in my life, my father had chosen to salute me. Not because of the rank I held, not because of my achievements, but because he was finally choosing to see me. I stood there for a long moment, my heart heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this. The years of silence, the rejection, the expectations I had never been able to meet in his eyes, it all culminated in this one simple act. This one moment of acknowledgement. And I returned the salute, not because he had earned my forgiveness, but because he had finally chosen truth. It wasn't about making peace with the past. It wasn't about fixing what had been broken for so long. It was about moving forward, about both of us acknowledging that the war we had been fighting was never about right or wrong, it was about understanding. And for the first time I understood him. We didn't say much after that. Words seemed inadequate after such a heavy exchange. But for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like a wall between us. It felt like the beginning of something new. When I left Arlington that day, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel hurt. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. A peace that came not from the acknowledgement of my father's mistake, but from the realization that I no longer needed him to define me. That night, I lay beside James, feeling his presence beside me. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't ask about the conversation. He simply held me, and for the first time I allowed myself to be held, to be vulnerable. He didn't have to say anything. I knew deep down that this was my moment of closure. Not because I had broken the chains of my father's approval, but because I had finally understood that I was enough, with or without his recognition. It wasn't long after Arlington that I received the call. It came through at 3 a.m., the kind of call that cuts through the stillness of the night with the clarity of a wake-up call. Navy Personnel Command. They asked if I would consider overseeing a new Joint Operations Initiative. It was a program designed to restructure training protocols across branches and integrate ethical command leadership into every level of the military. The kind of project I would have dreamed of 20 years ago. But now it felt like more than just a career move, it felt like legacy in motion. It was the kind of leadership I had fought for, bled for, and earned. Not just through rank but through action. I had spent years watching the system. I had seen the flaws, the areas that needed change. I had pushed to fix them quietly, consistently, making sure that the military wasn't just a place to execute orders but a space where true leadership could thrive. This new initiative was the culmination of all that hard work. It wasn't about military strategy or weaponry, it was about humanity. It was about ensuring that every person under command was given the support and the trust they deserved. As I read over the details of the initiative, I knew this was my chance to leave a mark on the military. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. This wasn't about my father or anyone else. This was about change. Real change. But as I prepared for the new role, the ghosts of my past continued to linger. The memories of my father's silence, his refusal to see me for who I truly was, haunted me in moments when I least expected it. But I had stopped looking for his approval, stopped seeking his recognition. The work I had done, the soldiers I had led, they saw me. They understood my value not because of my bloodline, but because of the work I had put in to earn their respect. The first week on the project was a whirlwind. Early meetings with brass, strategy briefings, and outlining the new protocols. It felt natural. I was in my element. But one morning, after an intense discussion with the leadership team, something unexpected happened. A name from my past surfaced in the meeting, Corporal Avery Patterson. The name hit me like a shockwave. Avery had been a part of my team years ago, a young sailor who had looked up to me when no one else did. I remembered him clearly, his quiet dedication, his relentless work ethic. He had been the one who had written me that note, the one who had silently thanked me for seeing him when everyone else had overlooked him. "Tell Admiral Holstead thank you. She's the only one who ever saw me." I hadn't known at the time how much that note had meant to me, how deeply it had impacted me. Now, as I stood in front of the leadership team, Avery's name resurfaced, and with it, the weight of the work I had done. It wasn't about the medals, the promotions, or the recognition. It was about the lives I had touched, the people I had helped along the way. Avery had made a difference just like I had. And now, he had joined the Navy, following in my footsteps, inspired by the same quiet leadership I had given him. It wasn't about me leading the charge in the spotlight, it was about creating the kind of environment where others could shine, where they could be seen, where they could be heard. It struck me then. I hadn't been alone in this journey. Avery wasn't just following my path. He was creating his own. And now, as part of this new initiative, I had the opportunity to help countless others find their own path. To teach them that leadership wasn't just about shouting orders, about wearing a uniform, it was about trust, respect, and integrity. It was about seeing the potential in others and giving them the tools to reach it. The call to action had always been the same for me: don't just serve. Don't just take commands. Inspire. The days following the initiative's launch were a blur of meetings, strategy sessions, and visits to various bases. Each stop was an opportunity to implement new protocols, push boundaries, and test the resilience of a system that had long been resistant to change. But with every success, there was also the quiet realization that this was no longer about proving myself. It wasn't about making my father see me for who I truly was. It was about something deeper, about changing a broken system and creating something sustainable. Still, there were moments when I couldn't shake the lingering doubts. The years of silence, of trying and failing to connect with my father, haunted me in the quiet hours of the night. The messages from the past, the ones that carried only rejection, had shaped me, built me, but they no longer held any power over me. My success, my leadership, and my ability to inspire had nothing to do with him anymore. It was in these moments of self-reflection that I truly understood the impact of the life I had led. The quiet ones, the ones who had been overlooked, the ones who had been told they weren't good enough, those were the people I had helped. And now, I had a responsibility to ensure that the system, the very structure I had fought to change, would carry that torch forward. As I stood in front of the mirror one morning, preparing for another round of meetings, my phone buzzed. Another message. This time it wasn't from my father. It was from one of my old team members, a message that carried the weight of the respect I had earned without ever asking for it. "Still thinking about your wedding day, ma'am? Never seen that many warriors cry during a ceremony." The words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized, not until this moment, how much that day had meant, not just to me but to everyone who had stood by me. The men and women who had fought beside me, who had followed my lead even when they had doubts, they had been the ones who truly understood me. They had been the ones who knew that my leadership wasn't about titles or medals. It was about integrity, about sacrifice, and about being there when it mattered most. I had walked down that aisle with my head held high, not because I was trying to prove anything to my father, but because I knew that my real family, the ones who had earned my respect, not because of bloodline but because of shared experiences, were the ones who had seen me at my weakest, at my strongest, and still believed in me. And that was worth more than any recognition I could ever get from my father. As the days passed, my focus shifted from my father's silence to the work ahead. The Pentagon initiative was gaining momentum, and with each success I could feel a shift within the system. The changes weren't going to happen overnight, but they were happening. And I knew that no matter what, this was the legacy I was building. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about titles. It was about real change, real impact. And if my father never understood that, then that was his loss. I had already forged my own path. The recognition I had earned was not in medals or in the praise of others. It was in the lives I had touched, the lives I had saved, and the respect I had earned through action. The change I had fought for was beginning to take shape, slowly but surely. With every adjustment to the training protocols, every new policy implemented, I saw progress. But progress, I had learned, often came with its own set of challenges. People resisted change, especially when it threatened their established ways of thinking, their comfortable routines. But there was something about the way I approached leadership that kept the momentum going. It wasn't about commanding from the front, it was about walking alongside those I led. It was about making them believe in themselves and showing them that they could lead too. As the weeks passed, the initiative continued to gain traction. The feedback from the field was positive. Soldiers, sailors, and officers alike were beginning to embrace the new culture, a culture rooted in mutual respect and accountability. But as the changes took hold, there was still one lingering question in the back of my mind: did I need my father's approval to feel complete? I had been so focused on achieving success, on proving myself in a world that had constantly underestimated me, that I hadn't fully considered the impact of his absence in my life. The man who had once been my role model, the man whose approval I had desperately sought, was still a ghost in the background. And even though I had made peace with his silence, even though I had stopped seeking his validation, there were still moments when I wondered if I would ever get the closure I needed. It was during one of those quiet moments as I stood on the balcony of my office overlooking the bustling city below, that I received another message. This time it wasn't from my father but from a familiar name, Avery Patterson. The same sailor who had once written me that note, the one who had always seen me for who I truly was. The message was simple, but it carried the weight of everything I had worked for. "Ma'am, I wanted to let you know that I made it. I've been promoted to the front lines. It's been a long road, but I'm here because of you. You saved my life and I'm forever grateful. I'm proud to follow in your footsteps." Reading those words, I realized something profound. I had been looking for validation in all the wrong places. It wasn't about my father. It wasn't about the years of silence or the constant rejection. It was about the impact I had made on the lives of those around me. It was about the people I had helped, the people who had walked beside me in battle, and the ones who were now following my example. The message from Avery didn't just bring closure, it brought something far more valuable. It brought peace. Peace in knowing that I had become the leader I had always aspired to be. Not because I had earned anyone's approval, but because I had earned respect through action, through leadership, and through the choices I had made along the way. As I stood there, reading Avery's message over and over again, I realized that my father had never truly understood me. He had never seen me as I was. But the people who mattered, my team, my soldiers, my chosen family, they saw me. They knew who I was and what I stood for. I had already earned the respect I had sought. And in that moment, I understood that true leadership isn't about validation from others. It's about earning your own respect and standing tall, no matter what anyone else thinks. It wasn't until months later, as the program continued to evolve and the success of the initiative was undeniable, that I realized something. The quiet moments, those brief pauses when everything felt still, had become the most meaningful part of this journey. I had spent so long chasing approval, chasing success, that I hadn't stopped to look at the impact I was making on the lives of others. One afternoon, while reviewing reports from several bases, I received an invitation to a closed-door event at the Pentagon. It wasn't the kind of event I usually attended. This was a leadership and transformation roundtable, with high-ranking officers and policymakers from all branches of the military. The topic was the future of command, and they wanted me to give a keynote speech on ethical leadership in modern warfare. Not because I was the first woman admiral or because of my rank, but because of the way I had redefined what it meant to lead with integrity. The invitation was unexpected. But when I thought about it, I realized that this wasn't just an opportunity to speak, it was an opportunity to continue the work I had started. The work that wasn't about titles or accolades, but about leaving a legacy, one of leadership, honor, and respect. As I prepared for the speech, I reflected on the journey that had led me here. From the rejection of my father to the countless nights spent doubting myself, to finally realizing that I had never needed his approval in the first place. The respect I had earned, the lives I had impacted, were more than I could have ever hoped for. And as I stood in front of that room full of the highest-ranking officials, I knew that this wasn't about proving a point anymore. It was about setting a new standard for what leadership could look like. The room was filled with brass and power, but as I spoke, it was clear that they weren't just listening to my words, they were hearing the truth in them. The truth that leadership isn't about command. It's about service. It's about standing up for what's right even when no one is watching. It's about lifting others up and showing them that they too have the power to lead, to make a difference. The applause that followed wasn't about me. It wasn't about the recognition or the title I held. It was about the impact of the message. It was about the change that was finally taking root. And as I walked off the stage, I felt the weight of everything that had led me here, everything that had shaped me into the leader I had become. But it wasn't about what I had achieved for myself. It was about what I had done for the people who had come after me. The soldiers who would follow in my footsteps, the ones who would benefit from the systems I had implemented, the ones who would lead with integrity because of the example I had set. Later that evening, a letter arrived at my office. It was from my father. The same handwriting, the same short, cold messages I had received for years. But this one was different. It was different not because of what it said, but because of what it meant. I watched your speech. I've read your proposals. You built a career that wasn't about proving anyone wrong, including me. You built it to save lives. I finally see that now. I didn't feel a sense of victory. I didn't feel a rush of emotion. I simply felt peace. The recognition I had longed for wasn't something he could give me. It was something I had earned for myself. When I handed the letter to James that night, he didn't need to ask what it meant. He simply held me quietly as we both understood the significance of that moment. The final chapter of this journey wasn't about my father's approval or recognition. It was about the peace I had found within myself. The peace that came from knowing that I had built something worth building, something that would last long after my time. And as I stood in front of the mirror the next morning, looking at the uniform I had earned, I knew that I wasn't just a leader in title. I was a leader in truth. And that, more than anything else, was the legacy I would leave behind.